at a certain point, I really started intensive study of the East Asian miracle, as we call it,
Right.
the East Asian tiger countries.
Yeah.
And then I started to realize, wait a minute, there is something really dynamic about a process of industrialization which pivots a country to a different level. You're talking about very rapid phases of growth, of diversification of the production base, of increases in per capita income levels. And all of that I learned in this period, and it was, in a way, like a golden era for Sri Lanka.
Could you tell us roughly during the 90s, the early 90s, what specific industrial policy, or were there specific policies that came together that we may be able to replicate to some degree in the current context?
Well, it's in a broad sense industrialization, but we were at a time in Sri Lanka where garments production was still not pervasive in so many countries.
Okay.
And so Sri Lanka had a big advantage because still that garments production, essentially it had been there in the East Asian, successful East Asian countries, and they were devolving it to other countries. So Sri Lanka then used the quota system that they had available to them, and aggressively went for, it was called the 200 garments factory strategy of President Premadasa, and incidentally Ranil Wickremesinghe was the Minister of Industry, so he was very instrumental in promoting that. Today, I think you have to look to lots of other products. You have to create a bit more of a diversified manufacturing base, but it is possible. Now, one thing that I have been studying quite closely because I teach in this country, and that is Vietnam.
Right.
So up till about 2012, I wasn't that interested in Vietnam, to be honest, because they didn't have an industrialization strategy. But they went through some really bad times. They had terrible currency problems. They had recurrent balance of payments problems. They had worked with the IMF from the late 1990s, but nothing seemed to work for them.
Okay.
Somewhere in 2012, a whole process started, and I had a lot of students who I'd been teaching in the Netherlands were Vietnamese, and several of them, and I had also brought a lot of Vietnamese students here to Sri Lanka.
Okay.
And by 2012, 6 of them were in very high positions in universities, and they wrote to me and said, Professor, can you please come to Vietnam and work with us? We would appreciate it, and so on, because one of the things they told me was that they're now involved in this aggressive industrialization strategy, and they knew it was like a carrot, to me. And so of course I was honored that they would ask me, and I went there. And literally after 1 year, I was asked to do a major television interview, on their business channel. And normally foreigners are not invited to do this. And I said, so what is this about? Oh, industrialization. We want you to explain to the Vietnamese people why it's so important, and to the Vietnamese business community.
Okay.
I've never been invited back to this channel. It must have been a disastrous interview. But it was clear the government had embarked on this strategy, and it was all hands to the deck. That's very typical of the Vietnamese. And I have watched a country grow in the most incredible speed. From 2012 till now, you cannot believe the transformation of that country. So we're not talking about, we're talking about 7 or 8 years. This is all we're talking about. And it keeps accelerating. One of the things that if anyone is studying Vietnam, while many developing countries suffered terribly in 2020 with the pandemic, and beyond even going into 2021, Sri Lanka, case in point, primarily because, of course, we were hit with tourism and remittances, Vietnam went in the opposite direction. Their reserves just exploded. Why? Because the industrial base allowed them to switch into home office equipment. Because everyone was working at home in the West, and Vietnam started to supply them. So their reserves just shot through the roof. And the currency also appreciated against the dollar, didn't depreciate, because the demand was insatiable in a way, you know. And this is what happens when you get into a manufacturing-based economy. You can diversify. You know, one thing leads to another, leads to another. And that is the secret of manufacturing. You see, when you're an agricultural economy, let's say you're producing tea, what do you diversify into? You know, maybe organic tea, maybe different flavors of tea, whatever. But actually the diversification is limited. Manufacturing, you're talking of 1 million+ categories of manufacturers.